Well, hello, I'm Dr. Judy Matthews. It's a real pleasure to join you again to continue our journey on an introduction to design thinking, very much in a health context. You'll remember I met many of you in the first module that we delivered, the introduction to design thinking. Today, what we're going to do is bring together, try to summarize, help you recall, maybe recap where you've been so far, the first 4 modules, bring them together, perhaps look at some possibilities in terms of, are there some things you'd like to learn more about, but then have a very brief talk about where we might go in the future. So I'll begin with sharing my screen. It may look very familiar to you, going back to the Heal Design. So module 5, we're calling it, the conclusion, bringing it all together. So hoping that a lot of what you've looked at in the past is still front of mind, but if not, today we're going to do a bit of a refresh. So you remember in the first beginning, when we talked about the introduction to design thinking, we emphasized that design thinking is in fact around human-centered design, but it's very much about design doing. Even though it's called thinking, it's not just thinking. It's very much about how do we use a human-centered approach to use design processes in our work. Also, I'm hoping you remember that the 3 criteria we broadly look at in relation to human-centered design is what is desirable in terms of outcomes, in terms of solutions, what's feasible, but also what's viable. What can we take forward that we'll be able to continue with over time? And if you look at the bottom of that screen, you may remember this framework that we looked at came originally from the D School. Why are we using it? It is one of many, but it's really a nice, simple way to get started, but mainly because human-centered design is certainly around empathizing. So we talked about empathizing is very much about learning who you're designing with and for, constructing a point of view in terms of, given all we know, where are we going in this particular instance, ideate, coming out with lots of ideas, but from those ideas, sorting them out, evaluating them, and then choosing a couple to progress in the main through some rapid prototyping tests, making those ideas much more tangible so we can test them out, testing them with users and stakeholders, and then seeing where we're at. And often it's about going back and doing it all again. Remember, it's a non-linear process, so that's why I put repeat. We tend to keep going until we actually have something we can take and implement. I also have on that front page a potential challenge. How might we? Remember the how? It's a question. Might, we have to imagine in terms of coming up with some new ways. We, working together collaboratively, assist health professionals, in this case, to provide the best quality care, which I know is really what you're all determined to do, but also to experience the best possibilities their clients and patients. So really, human-centered design brings in this whole notion of experience. What does it feel like? What are the social factors? Certainly, top quality healthcare is what we're all about, but then how do we want people to feel in this process? Once again, going right back to the beginning in our introduction, I wanted to bring to your attention this quote from Herb Simon. And of course, and this is quite a long time ago now, his view is that everyone who devises courses of action aimed at changing an existing situation into a preferred one is a designer. And if that's true, then of course we're all designing all the time. We may not think of ourselves as designing, but that's actually what's happening. And we really want to come to such situations very much from a beginner's mindset. Thinking, okay, I wonder what's actually happening here. Questioning, finding patterns, really being very curious about what is happening and why, and what might be the triggers and what are the consequences. But to do this with this design mindset, thinking first around about the person who's really in the center of this. What are their needs? What are their feelings? What are their sources of pain and sources of gain? And how can we actually devise some solutions which will take that into account? Integrating really what we know from our analytical skills, which we all have and probably at this stage quite highly developed, but also touching into these human-centered needs that sometimes aren't easy to diagnose, being optimistic about new and possible solutions, being quite experimental in terms of where we might go and being quite open to new possibilities, and once again, collaborating. One of us is not as good as all of us. And to do this, of course, we're suggesting it's about having a holistic view of a situation, really understanding it takes a lot of effort and passion to bring ideas to life. So we'll probably need quite relatively high energy here. Some willingness to take some risks, because often the road we're going to chart may not have already been done. Using visual skills and visualization, and really exploring what it would feel like for people in those situations, but mainly empathizing with the human side of situations. That's really crucial. Now, in Module 2, with Dr. Natalie Wright, she really explored in great detail empathizing, really immersing yourself in a situation, exploring what are the possibilities, understanding what's there, but also what's not there. And to do that, of course, we gather information, sometimes in obvious ways through ethnographic conversations, really finding out what's important to people in their context, creating visual summaries. Sometimes it's about just taking photos, being in a situation where patients are coming or clients are coming and taking photos about how they're feeling, what's working, what isn't, sometimes shadowing, following them around, but then bring that information together in a visual way, as well as other ways, to see what we know. And we will develop this into some really good and useful templates. We'll be using some personas, some empathy maps to really summarize those views and experiences, and really looking at those sources of pain. What are people really upset about? What they really like to see. And then using touch points, using a journey map in terms of what happens when people have contact with their organisation. Is it easy? Is it difficult? What parts work? What parts don't? Are there some things we can relatively easily fix? And of course, we then can combine all that information together, because it often isn't until we see it all, often perhaps we call it, put it on posters or a gallery wall, that we actually see the themes come through. And Dr. Wright presented some great examples of that in Module 2. And we'll refer to that as we go along. So thinking back to Module 3, remember there are two parts here, both define and ideate. So first of all, why define? Well, what's important about define is if we know where we're going, we're more likely to get there. So we usually start off with this whole process of how might we? And really it's how might we do something? How might we take some action to achieve what is our desired objectives? So an example there that came out from one of the first workshops we ran with Clinical Excellence Queensland. This was part of an iterative development of the question. How might we redesign the physical environment for patients with functional limitations to physically access Logan Hospital Respiratory Department? So that's actually very precise. It says, how might we? Excellent. How might we take some action, redesign the physical environment for who? Patients with functional limitations. Why? Because we want to help them physically access Logan Hospital Respiratory Department. So that has all the ingredients, and that's really why I've used that as an example. A way to progress that a bit is to develop what we call a project brief. So we highlight what it is we want to do. We look at who's involved, who are the users and the stakeholders. We look at what we want to find out. What are some of the key questions? What do we want to know about our users? And what is our desired outcomes? What would we like to see? Usually it needs to be something that's fast, that's easy, that's accessible, and that people can enjoy. And what are our success metrics? How will we know if we're getting there, if we've made some progress towards these goals? And remember, as well as define, our next one was very much on ideate. Now, ideate, of course, is one of the fun parts. Not that the others aren't fun, but this is a particularly beginning of lots of fun, because to get new ideas and good ideas, we want to generate as many as possible. And this is well known, particularly if you looked at the Steve Johnson, how do we get good ideas? It's very clear there. And Dr. Wright gave you some great examples, and really it's about generating lots of ideas, really this divergent thinking, and then getting them together, looking at themes, putting them in groups, looking at perhaps there's some ways we can combine some of these great ideas, and then evaluating in terms of, okay, which of these would we like to take forward? And ways to do that, of course, are with the dot voting, which you illustrated very nicely, or even a de Bono's approach, where are the benefits? There's no benefits, don't continue. So what are the benefits? Is it feasible? Do we have the resources? And does it fit with the way we do things? And from that, we'll develop those concepts, test some assumptions, and then look at how do we rapidly prototype some of these ideas and take them forward. Now, once again, Professor Miller, Evonne Miller, really gave you lots of great examples of rapid prototyping. Why do we do rapid prototyping? And remember, with design thinking, EMPATHISE and rapid prototyping are really the signature processes that maybe we don't look at in other idea generating and problem solving approaches. So in rapid prototyping, and this is one, of course, the areas that designers excel, is they're very good at making ideas tangible, sometimes developing artifacts, developing scenarios where we might work through some of these new ideas and solutions, but it's about demonstrating. It's not about telling, because telling we all tend to switch off a little, or we get our own picture in our mind. Demonstrating actually involves us all, bringing those concepts to life and think, okay, what can we learn by running through this model? There's an example here of, once again, a potential solution that came from our first Introduction to Design Thinking workshop with Clinical Excellence Queensland, where there was a group of people who were concerned about how people were upset and actually quite annoyed about waiting issues, when really there seemed to be some processes that could very easily solve those problems. So they said, well, what about an arrivals and departures board? And they put it back. So what's awesome about this idea? Patients can see live updates of the surgery waiting time, so they know where their schedule is and if it's likely to happen today. Staff are able to give more accurate updates. And if the surgery is postponed, kitchen's informed, the patient then gets food, so they're not hungry and they're not angry. And in fact, the whole situation is actually defused. So thinking about that's one example. And sometimes what we do is we run through that, we'd actually act that out and then say, okay, how can we refine that? How do we make it more accurate? And of course, some great tools to do that, which have already been shown to you. And we'll talk about some other ways of doing that. So that's pretty much the first four processes, I beg your pardon. And of course, with rapid prototyping comes testing. I'm not sure what's happened to testing, but it seemed to be jumped over. But to test, of course, we take it to the clients and say, okay, what works here, what doesn't? What do we need to do to refine it? How do we improve it for you? So looking at all that, I guess we're wondering about what is your understanding of design thinking so far? What's your journey been like? And we're wondering, have you found yourself actually looking at situations in a new way? Perhaps remembering that we are all designing, perhaps taking much more of a user's perspective? Have you started thinking like a designer? Even though we're designing all the time, we don't always think that way. Are you now thinking, how might we create better experiences and outcomes for users? Are you actually sketching what's happening, taking photos of what's happening in a situation, noting when it happens, how often it happens, and are there some particular triggers and influences? Does it only happen on a Monday morning? Does it happen after a long weekend? Does it happen when there's been a big delay? And I guess we're also wondering what pieces are still fuzzy for you or not clear, and maybe what's missing for you, because once we know that, we can actually do something about it. So as well as that, I guess we're wondering, what are the highlights for you so far? Are there some things that excite you? Are some things that challenge you? And maybe have you already looked at some problem or challenge that you've discussed with your colleagues already? It's maybe a front of mind issue that you've been aware of for quite a while and thinking, okay, maybe we as a team, as a group, need to really do something about this. And stepping back, I guess, we're wondering, what is it that stimulates you to think about and perhaps begin to document, perhaps begin to photograph what's working and what's not working? Because it isn't until we actually capture that information and make it available to people so it becomes front of mind for a group of people that we tend to take some action. What encourages you to collect that data, and how will you display that data? Where does it need to be? Obviously, it might need to be in a private space, as distinct from something where you may find clients. Where would you have to do that? In addition, I guess, are there some particular challenges that you've been facing as you work through these modules? Have you thought about how you might develop your visual thinking skills? And maybe, and certainly sketching always helps. And of course, if we're not used to doing that, we often need to encourage ourselves to do that, maybe do it perhaps in a very regular practice. Taking photos is very useful, and of course, very easy with smartphones. But also it's about presenting data in useful ways. And in fact, infographics have become very popular, and I know you may be used to doing these, and there's a little link here on this slide to make it easier. Very powerful way of presenting information. Yeah. So what we're looking at here, more broadly speaking, in terms of human-centered design and how we can make a difference to people's lives, is about converting a problem situation into a positive experience. And I know some of you may have already looked at the David Kelly video on how to encourage and develop creative confidence. This is an example from that. And if you've seen it already, I'm just really refreshing you. But obviously from a health context, you would probably recognize this as an MRI machine, but it's a very different MRI machine, because what's happened here is a very senior technician was noting that when children were put in MRI machines, they were very unhappy. They were crying, they needed to be sedated, parents were upset, clinicians were then upset. So it was actually very a traumatic experience. So what he did is he arranged for people from museums to come and customize this whole experience. And so what they did is they changed it to a pirate experience. So when the children came here, they were told they were now in a pirate ship. They had to be very quiet and sit very still for quite a long time. They didn't want to be discovered by the pirates. And so having that whole reframing of that context from, certainly it was a diagnostic process and sometimes a treatment process for children, into something that was like much more imaginary and they could really involve themselves in, became a much more positive experience. And in fact, as you'd see on the video, at the end of one of these sessions, the little girl came up to her mother and said, "Mummy, can I come back tomorrow?" And of course, this is very different to children needing to be sedated, parents feeling very stressed, clinicians being stressed, and of course, the whole context reframed into a much more positive experience. So how can we reframe the context in which we're working with people, where often health, we know, is often a critical situation. There's not a lot of room for a lot of experimentation, but how can we make it a more positive experience for everybody involved, for the users, for their families and carers, but also for staff? So reflecting on your journey with design thinking so far, are there some ways that we can help you progress your understanding of design thinking and its potential in a health context? We know and respect, and I certainly know that you live this, that health is actually a complex, multi-layered system with many systems that interact and provide lots of possibilities for diagnosis, treatment, but also long-term care. We're wondering if you found how design thinking has been explored and implemented in different health contexts. We've presented a small range of what's possible, and I know from the readings and the videos, you'll learn much more. Have you had a chance to immerse yourself in the resources and readings? I know many people coming to design thinking from outside find the videos actually very useful. What we tend to see is people then develop a deep understanding of their own current context, and they begin to explore what are some of the possible challenges and opportunities that exist there. I'm going to encourage you to perhaps follow up with an example from Monash Health. Why Monash Health? Well, it's really an Australian example, and you may have already looked at the experience-based co-design toolkit that Dr. Wright mentioned to you. There's some lovely experiences in there. This example comes from one group of health professionals who are very concerned about improving both their treatment, but also their understanding of what's happening with their clients. And they drill down in many multiple areas. This comes from, well, it's really a collection of case studies called Design Thinking for the Greater Good, which I guess is really what we're all on about, innovation in the social sector. And this is just one of the case studies, but it's very much an Australian example, and it's about health. And so what they did is they drilled down to look at the experience of one person. So this is one person, Tom, and they went into it in some detail. And you'll understand this is actually very different to taking a survey. It's actually looking at one or two people who, to try to understand what it is they're going through, what are they feeling, what are they experiencing? And so really this whole analysis found many different varieties of what happened to this person, and probably none of them are ones that we would see as optimal. So just looking at that in some more detail, I mentioned before gathering information and using some templates to make this simpler, and I guess to bring that information together, things like personas, empathy maps, but also journey maps are really interesting, where you spend the time to actually talk to someone and find out what are their interactions with our context, whether it's a ward or an outpatient or regardless of where you are. This detail found not only did he have face-to-face with 3 different clinicians, but he had different case managers, 70 different touch points, 18 handoffs over his treatment process, 5 different information management systems, 15 different patient records. So you can see the potential for really not a smooth experience. So one of the reasons we do journey maps, and we actually do them with the user to find out not just our perception of what their journey map is, but what it's like for them to diagnose the situation. But we could see in terms of if we wanted to create a desirable future, and we need to think of this as both clinicians, but also service providers, what would be an optimal journey for Tom? And what would he like to experience? And really the way to find that out is to talk to him, or the person, the user at the end. But keep in mind those 3 possibilities. What's desirable for Tom? So we'd be using a lot of design thinking processes there. What's feasible in terms of what the organisation can deliver, and what's viable. And of course, looking at this particular example, and you'd find this if you read the case study, really what they did is, first of all, they really looked at what's happening with the information management systems. Really, we need to have some streamlining of that, as well as a positive experience for our user. So moving from that context, looking at what's happening with you in your current situation, what sort of information would you need to get started? And I guess you have, if you're already on this journey and thinking, how can I use design thinking where I am? You're probably already looking at what do I know and what don't we know? Where can you find the information you need? What's working? It's always good to start with what's working. Very much an appreciative inquiry approach, because usually there's something that's working. And if you know what that is and you can actually expand on that, that's often a really good way to go forward. But what's not working? Taking photos, sketches, examples, getting even your users to tell you what the barriers are and what the problems are is very powerful. Collect that in really great detail, you know, the who, what, when, where, why, how, and posting that up to actually gain some information, because we tend to find we all have little bits of information. It's when we put them together, it becomes very powerful. But also I want you to think about, how much do I care? Because often it's about having a team behind you, a collaborative approach, because to make change, one person usually isn't enough, and it does take time and energy, and usually not just insights from patients, but insights from other stakeholders. Who should you work with? Well, remember, collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. Be clear who the beneficiaries are, and even thinking back to that MRI machine, the beneficiaries were certainly the users and their families, but the beneficiaries are also the clinical staff and the whole organisation. How do we gain insights from users in terms of knowing what their latent needs are, who should be on the team, what knowledge and skills are available? Are there some key people we need to recruit? Do we need to involve a lot of OTs and social workers and other health professionals in both in our diagnostic, but also in terms of going forward? Is there an experienced design thinking facilitator who can help and who would commit to being involved over time? How do I get started? Well, remember, going right back to the beginning, begin with this design thinking mindset. Begin to understand it's possible. Empathizing with our users and our stakeholders, really understanding that the fact it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's not important, that it's not possible. It's that we need to experiment a bit and find out what does work, when, where, and how, and maybe how do we refine that and integrate all those processes in a collaborative and inclusive way with our colleagues. And don't forget to frame it as a how might we question. Thinking about how do I find out those needs? Those ethnographic conversations are really important, because you actually get information and we use them when we're putting it together. We actually would be working with people to help them draw out their journey map. What is it like for you? How are you feeling at different parts along this? Are you worried when you come to the hospital? And often people are, because sometimes it's a major crisis. They may not have had anything to do with medical experiences before. And so there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of uncertainty. And of course, a lot of anxiety about how am I going to be? Am I going to survive this? Will people listen to my story? All those sorts of things. Gather them and map them out so you can actually get the dimensions of what's happening. But also try to be clear on what you'd like to see. What are the desired outcomes? What would be the ideal situation for the patients and staff? And how will you know if you've made progress? Because while it's important to work on what we want, how will we know if you've made some progress? If we've made a difference to the situation, then of course we can keep going. So have some metrics. Is it about client satisfaction? Is it about confidence that really what you're delivering is the best that your organisation can do? And this is an example from one of the first workshops we did with Clinical Excellence Queensland, which Dr. Wright explained to you. That's a bit more of a detailed thing in terms of what you might look at if you're wanting to develop a bit of a project. And that can be a way of actually involving others, spelling out what the problem is and taking on board their views of it, as well as really what are the expected outcomes and how will you know if you're almost there. So where do you go from here? Well, of course, there are many options. One is to learn more about design thinking. And of course, one way of doing that and to include and increase your knowledge and skills is certainly to immerse yourselves in the readings and the videos, perhaps encourage your colleagues to work through the Introduction to Design Thinking modules that we've developed for Clinical Excellence Queensland. That way you'll actually have some common terminologies, some common understandings, and that's quite a good base to go forward with. There are also many courses. There's some free courses run by IDEO.org, and of course Acumen also runs some, I think, 6 to 7 week courses on everything from human-centered design to rapid prototyping. And of course, there are many more online, IDEO University, Darden Business School, and many, many more. They're growing by the day in terms of quite expensive courses. So that's your learning about, but learning by doing, in fact, it's a very rich way of learning and probably one that we're wanting to encourage. So maybe start on some small focused mini project, if you like, that you really like to see in your situation. You really like to see some change made. Frame it as a how might we? Take some action to achieve our objectives. Develop a bit of a brief in terms of what's now and really where you're wanting to go to. And you can use, there's lots of either those particular resources we mentioned earlier, like Bootcamp Bootleg, which actually has a very clear map of maybe what you might do. And also think about maybe working with a design thinking facilitator, either within the health system or outside, and maybe even through QUT Design Lab, who could maybe work with you in a committed way over time. These things, while we might run some design sprints and actually get some ideas, to actually take that further and implement takes a lot longer than just 1 or 2 short workshops. It's a much bigger commitment. It's a way of getting started, but often to make some real change really involves the decision makers. And so working with a design thinking facilitator can make that happen. So we're hoping you're now developing your own design thinking toolkit that very much is, remember, around that design mindset and thinking who are the users, who are the people involved, using some design thinking framework, whether it's a D-School approach, whether it's a double diamond, which is, I guess, a more British approach, or even other ones that are referred to in our literature at the end. Using the useful templates. Why? Because they bring information together. They're actually quite simple and easy to use, but also they become part of the whole terminology in ways of capturing information. Personas are really important because actually, when you think of what happened with our fellow Tom before, we've got some very different understanding now of what life has been for him in terms of his interaction with our organisation. The empathy map spells that all out. What do they see and think and feel? And really what bothers them? What are their sources of pain, as well as what they would really like to see? And journey maps are very important. I can't emphasize that enough. And storyboard really happens in terms of putting stuff together, but also when you're doing this collaboratively, it's very easy to develop some variations using something that's out there, something you can all work on together. Remember, it's a team sport. So stepping back now, what are your reflections? What do you now know and understand about design thinking from the 5 modules, from your readings, your videos, and maybe even in your own personal search? What new examples of applications of design thinking in medical contexts have you found? There are many, many. We've referred to a few in these modules, but there are many. And Dr. Wright presented you with some very good literature, which I'd suggest you follow through. But often we find that videos actually convince people even more than text and case studies. And how might you then apply these design thinking principles, processes, and practices in your context? We'd really like to see you explore some of these in some detail. I've been teaching design thinking to MBA students at QUT for almost 10 years now, many times a year. And this is really to professionals across a range of professions, certainly includes health, education, engineering, finance, pretty much any context you can imagine. And I guess, why do I teach and why do I enjoy teaching it? I see how people really grow in their knowledge of design thinking. They're much more confident. They understand, they're much more focused now on what are the needs of the users. And so not only are they enriching their own understanding and practice, they're making a difference for their users and their stakeholders they work with. They're developing a collaborative approach with their team, and often very diverse people within their organizations, as well as the users, capturing that user voice and really co-designing with others as well as the users, but really making a difference to the organizations in terms of their alignment. How do we actually deliver not just the best care we can, but also the experience of that service? So just going back, quick reflection, empathize. Remember, empathize and prototype are the ones that are really key here. Use empathy to explore, to understand, to gather, to put together, to find what it is you're trying to do and where you're wanting to go. Ideate, lots of fun. Multiple creative ideas, and sometimes go for the craziest ideas, and then you can always bring them back. But sometimes they have a kernel of something new. This low fidelity prototyping, we're just making something fast. It's not about having a prototype in a manufacturing context. It's about, okay, let's put this together. What could it look like? How can we bring this to life? Testing it with your users, looking at what works and what doesn't, and then negotiating the implementation. And of course, if you've had some of those stakeholders involved from the beginning, and you already have lots of their good ideas, they're usually more than too keen to carry forward. So some other resources, the video I mentioned before, how to build creative confidence, very useful to look at. There's a longer version, which is a more comprehensive version, looking at really how do we encourage agency in people, this feeling of self-efficacy, of mastery in a context. And I think that applies to pretty much all of us. And there's a short version which actually just cuts straight to the chase. I've also added some work on some other research looking at design thinking in a broader context in terms of design thinking for the greater good, which is where the Monash case study comes from. Some templates from the Designing for Growth fieldbook, but also Professor Leakey's more recent one on experiencing design, because what she does is she realizes while an understanding is really important, while the tools and techniques and the design thinking toolbox and design thinking playbook are really some good ways of introducing some new ways of doing things. And of course, the healthcare design and innovation brings together a lot of the research that's happened through the HEAL Lab in relation to their work with QUT and the QUT Design Lab. Really, it's about when people experience design, and human-centered design in particular, that's really what convinces them that there's something there to do. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite you to please explore design thinking, human-centered design in your own context. Let us know if we can help you. From the QUT Design Lab, we'd only be too pleased to work with you again. All the best.